Every morning began the same way, checking medication supplies, reviewing the appointment book, preparing IVs for the diabetics in cell block 3. Her little kingdom was located in the west wing of the Oak Creek Maximum Security Prison, and in the 3 years she'd worked there, she'd learned every corner of it. At 9:30, the usual reception began. Prisoners came in one by one, accompanied by a guard, complaining of headaches, insomnia, old injuries. Merritt wrote down the symptoms on the cards, dispensed the prescribed medicines, and made bandages. Her movements were perfected to the point of automatism, but she listened carefully to each patient. It made them feel like people, not numbers. The day went on as usual until a new patient showed up at the beginning of the second shift. A guard ushered in a tall man with a bandage on his right arm. "Inmate Rafe Caldwell, laundry work injury," the guard said mundanely as he handed Merritt a card. As she read the notes, Caldwell studied the room in silence. His posture, in spite of the handcuffs, was strangely loose. Merritt noted the regular features of his face, the attentive gaze of his gray eyes. The prisoner looked neither depressed nor aggressive, but rather interested. Examination showed a slight burn from the steamer. As she tended to the wound, Merritt felt the muscles under her fingers tense. A subtle warmth emanated from the patient, and she caught herself thinking the touch had lingered longer than necessary. "Miss Hope, are you all right?" came the harsh voice of Greta Stern, head of the infirmary, from the doorway. Merritt flinched and hurriedly finished dressing. Greta was notorious for her suspiciousness and strictness. She demanded that all safety protocols be followed with the utmost precision. In the evening, back home, Merritt settled into her favorite chair with a new novel. The story told of a girl's passionate love for a mysterious criminal. Usually such plots captured her completely, but today her attention kept slipping away. The face of today's patient, his confident movements, his attentive gaze. Merritt put the book aside and went to the mirror. She had never thought of herself as a beauty. Plain appearance, brown hair in a tight bun, minimal makeup. Uniform clothes carefully hid all feminine curves, but today she suddenly wanted to let her hair down, to run her fingers along the back of her neck. Merritt resolutely turned away from the mirror. Such thoughts were an unacceptable luxury for a prison nurse. During the night, she dreamed of the infirmary, flooded with unusually bright light and of footsteps in the empty corridor. In the morning, she couldn't remember the details of the dream, but the feeling of slight excitement remained. Getting ready for work, Merritt pulled a bottle of her favorite perfume out of the closet for the first time in a long time. Just a single drop, a barely perceptible scent. She tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, that today would be the same as hundreds of previous days, with the smell of antiseptic, the creaking of gurneys, and the monotonous filling out of cards. But somewhere in the back of her mind, Merritt knew that wasn't true. The med bay would never be the same again. Over the next 2 weeks, Rafe Caldwell showed up at the infirmary 5 times. First, he came for a burn dressing, then he complained of a headache, then insomnia. Twice, he asked for an appointment with vague complaints of malaise. Merritt realized that most of the symptoms were far-fetched, but she couldn't refuse to see him. Protocol required that any inmate complaints be thoroughly checked. His card read, "Caldwell Rafe James, 38 years old, sentence 15 years, armed robbery." Merritt was careful not to read the details of the case. It was an unspoken rule in the infirmary to treat the body without thinking about the crimes. But sometimes, at night, she imagined how Rafe planned the robbery, how he held the gun with his strong hands. These thoughts made her uneasy and strangely excited. During the morning 5 minutes, Greta Stern frowned her eyebrows more and more as she looked over the reception log. "Miss Hope, are you sure that inmate Caldwell requires such frequent medical attention?" Her question hung in the air. Merritt nodded calmly, listing all the recorded symptoms. Technically, there was nothing to pick on. She began to be more careful about her appearance. Her uniform robe was always impeccably ironed, a light silk scarf around her neck, her hair styled in a soft wave. "Just want to look professional," she explained to her reflection. But an inner voice mockingly wondered who the change was really for. On another visit, Rafe asked to take her blood pressure. Merritt felt his pulse quicken under her fingers. "You care so much for your patients, Miss Hope." A faint huskiness flickered in his voice. She was embarrassed and took a step back, pretending to study the reading on the tonometer. After work, Merritt wandered around the park for long periods of time, trying to sort out her feelings. She liked to imagine chance encounters, not in a sterile medical unit, but here, among the fall trees. What would he look like in normal clothes? What would they talk about? The fantasies grew more vivid and detailed. In the prison library, she borrowed several books on criminal psychology. In the evenings, she read stories about people who had broken the law for various reasons: passion, desperation, thrill-seeking. I tried to understand what motivated people like Rafe. In the back of her mind, there was a mad hope. Maybe he wasn't so guilty. Maybe he was framed or coerced. One morning, she noticed Rafe limping. "Pulled a muscle at the gym," he explained with a faint smile. Examining his leg, Merritt felt a shiver run through her body at the touch of the heated skin. Was it just her imagination, or was his breathing hitching as well? The moment had only lasted a few seconds, but the memory of it haunted her all day. Greta peered into the office more often during appointments. Her keen eye noted every detail: a new barrette in Merritt's hair, a slightly brighter lip gloss, a particular care in the management of medical records. "A reminder of the importance of keeping your distance with inmates," she said dryly after one of Rafe's visits. In the women's locker room, Merritt overheard a nurse from another shift discussing that handsome guy from the laundry room with a friend. A sudden jealousy stirred inside. All evening, she had imagined Rafe flirting with the other nurses, giving them the same attentive glances. The thoughts made her mood sour. She began to check her reflection in the mirror before every visit, fixing her hair, furtively refreshing her lipstick. At times like this, Merritt hated herself for this weakness, but she couldn't help it. Something inexplicable drew her to this man, made her heart beat faster at the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Rafe never overstepped the bounds of propriety, was always polite and reserved. But sometimes Merritt caught long glances from him, noticed the way he watched her movements. At such times, the air between them became electrified, and simple medical procedures turned into an unspoken game full of hidden tension. Once, as he handed her a card, he held her hand in his for a moment. The touch was fleeting, almost imperceptible to the eye, but Merritt felt as if an electric shock had run through her skin. For the rest of the day, she absent-mindedly touched where she felt the warmth of his fingers. At night, she hardly slept at all, tossing and turning in bed. Her fantasies grew bolder and bolder: chance encounters in an empty hallway, unspoken words, forbidden touches. In the morning, Merritt looked at herself in the mirror and didn't recognize her face. There was a new sparkle in her eyes. Her cheeks flushed more often. She realized she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. In early November, the infirmary went quiet earlier than usual. Most of the prisoners had returned to their cells after dinner, and only the occasional footsteps of the guards broke the silence of the corridor. Merritt was about to finish her shift when Rafe appeared in the doorway, accompanied by an escort. "He has a laceration on his forearm, needs treatment," the guard reported. Caldwell sat silently on the couch, rolling up the sleeve of his robe. The long cut looked shallow, but it needed attention. Merritt put on her gloves and began cleaning the wound, trying to ignore the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "It's going to sting a little," she warned, touching the wound with the antiseptic-soaked washcloth. Rafe didn't flinch, only scrutinized her hands. When Merritt reached for the bandage, his fingers slid weightlessly over her wrist. The touch lasted a split second, but it burned her skin even through the latex glove. After this incident, Merritt began to stay for extra shifts more and more often. She attributed it to a desire to work, but in reality she was waiting for him to show up. The evening hours were quieter in the infirmary, with fewer prying eyes. Sometimes it seemed to her that Rafe chose that time for his visits. Once, looking through his chart after another appointment, she found a small piece of paper neatly folded into 4. Her heart sank as she unfolded the note. Just a few words in clear handwriting. "You are the most beautiful thing I have seen in the last 5 years." Merritt hastily tucked the note into the pocket of her robe, feeling her cheeks burn. That evening, she reread those lines over and over again until the letters began to blur in front of her eyes. His voice sounded in her head, calm and deep. She imagined him writing those words while thinking of her. The note seemed like a real treasure, tangible proof that her feelings were not unrequited. The next day, Merritt pulled out a special perfume from her closet, a light floral scent she saved for special occasions. She styled her hair in soft waves and lightly eyelined her eyes. The mirror reflected a different woman, rejuvenated, inspired, with a feverish gleam in her eyes. That evening, Merritt deliberately stayed late. The wound on Rafe's forearm required regular treatment, and she'd made an appointment for him to see her last night. Waiting until most of the staff had dispersed, she made a note in the logbook that the procedure was urgent. He showed up accompanied by a sleepy guard. Merritt asked him to wait outside the door, citing the need for a thorough examination. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for fresh bandages. Gathering her resolve, she quietly asked Rafe to remove his robe from his top so she could treat the wound more comfortably. Her heart raced at the thought of seeing his naked torso. But Rafe, without taking his gaze from her, slowly removed the entire robe. Merritt froze, unable to move. It was too explicit, too far from her romantic fantasies, and that made it all the more exciting. In his gaze, she could read such blatant desire that it took her breath away. The guard's footsteps sounded muffled outside the door of the medical room. Merritt knew she should interrupt the examination immediately, call security, report the disturbance. Instead, she stepped closer. His hands slid around her waist, pulling her to him, and reality dissolved in a dizzying whirlpool of new sensations. After that evening, they began to find any excuse to meet. The back room of the infirmary became their secret hideout. Merritt learned to masterfully fake journal entries, making up plausible reasons for Rafe's visits. He'd tell her his story about his misunderstood intentions, the fateful accident that had led him to jail. He said he'd never met anyone who understood him like that before. Merritt absorbed every word, convincing herself that she was seeing the real him, the one the justice system had missed. After each meeting, she returned home elated, believing in her special mission. It seemed to her that their love could change him, help him on the path of correction. She envisioned their future after his release, making plans for a new life. Rafe skillfully maintained this illusion. He spoke of remorse, of wanting to start over. Every touch, every look was filled with the promise of a better future. Merritt did not notice how cleverly he manipulated her feelings, how skillfully he directed her actions. Greta Stern noticed the change in her subordinate. Her suspicious gaze followed Merritt's every move, especially during Caldwell's visits. "Miss Hope, don't you think you're spending too much time on one patient?" she asked one day after a planning session. Merritt shrugged quietly, citing professional duty. Their meetings had continued. Now every touch during the examination seemed to be filled with a special meaning. Rafe found ways to pass short notes to her, in her medical records, in her robe pocket, even in a stack of blank forms. Merritt kept his every word like a jewel, rereading it in moments of solitude. She began to notice how his gaze changed at her appearance. There was something predatory, hungry in his gray eyes. It was frightening and exciting at the same time. Merritt realized she was crossing a dangerous line, but she couldn't and wouldn't stop. For the first time in years, she realized what those proverbial butterflies in her stomach felt like. In the prison library, Merritt now borrowed love novels, imagining herself as the heroine of a story of forbidden passion. Reality and fantasy intertwined, creating a heady cocktail of emotions. She caught herself constantly thinking about Rafe, his hands, his voice, his furtive glances. Once, during a dressing session, he'd asked her to lean closer, ostensibly to show her something on the wound. As she leaned over his hand, his breath touched her neck. "You smell so sweet," he whispered, barely audible. Merritt felt her knees go up. Luckily, at that moment, footsteps were heard in the hallway, and she hurried away. Greta began to make more frequent surprise inspections. She looked at the admission logs, checked the amount of medication used, questioned the other nurses. Merritt could feel her scrutinizing gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to be more careful. Every encounter with Rafe was worth every risk. In her spare time, Merritt imagined what their lives might have been like under different circumstances. She fantasized about chance encounters in cafes, walks in the park, quiet evenings together. Reality broke into these dreams with the sound of prison keys and creaking bars, but even that could not shatter her illusions. At night, she often woke up in a cold sweat, remembering his touch. In the darkness, everything seemed especially sharp. Desire, fear, anticipation of a new meeting. In the morning, she stood under the shower for long periods of time, trying to wash away the obsession, but it only grew stronger every day. The other nurses began whispering behind her back. Merritt heard bits and pieces of conversation, noticed the slanted glances, but she didn't care. Her whole world had narrowed down to brief encounters in the infirmary, to casual touches and secret notes. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't imagine her life any other way. In mid-November, Greta called her into her office for a serious conversation. "Miss Hope, I've noticed a change in your behavior. Perhaps you should take a vacation?" Merritt politely declined, assuring her boss that she was fine. As she left the office, she felt her hands trembling, but not from fear, from the anticipation of her next meeting with Rafe. Greta Stern couldn't help but notice the change. She saw the blush on the young nurse's cheeks, her dreamy gaze, the unnaturally frequent delays at work. More and more entries for procedures for the inmate Caldwell appeared in the logbook. Medications began to disappear in strange quantities. One day, Greta stayed late, ostensibly sorting through paperwork. She heard muffled voices from the back room, saw shadows under the door, but it was hard to prove anything. Merritt always had a plausible explanation for her actions, and the journal entries were impeccable. There were new traits in Rafe's demeanor, too. Now he was more confident, more commanding. More and more often he asked Merritt for small favors, to bring extra medication, to pass a note to another prisoner, to find out the guard's duty schedule. She agreed without thinking of the consequences. Greta made another attempt to get through to her subordinate. She called Merritt into her office and asked her directly about the nature of her relationship with the prisoner, but she only smiled distantly and assured her boss that everything was fine. She was just fulfilling her duties in good faith. By the end of December, the evidence folder on Greta's desk had grown noticeably thicker. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't want to ruin the young woman's career with unfounded accusations. She needed hard evidence, and Merritt continued to live in her ghostly world, where love can change human nature, where a criminal can become the hero of a novel, where forbidden passion is more important than duty and law. Every night, locking the backroom door, she felt like the heroine of a love novel. And each time it was harder and harder to return to reality, where their relationship was a crime, not a love story. She didn't notice the clouds gathering over her head, the scrutinizing eyes watching her, the inexorably approaching denouement of this dangerous game. Rafe was becoming more demanding, his requests more insistent, but Merritt wrote it off to the strength of his feelings. It seemed to her that she was finally truly living, not existing. There are no real secrets in a prison environment, only temporarily hidden facts. And while Merritt dangled in the clouds of her fantasies, reality was slowly but surely approaching the point from which there was no return. January began with a snowstorm. The white veil outside the windows of the infirmary created an illusion of detachment from the outside world. Merritt liked that feeling, as if she and Rafe existed in their own space, where there were no bars or inhibitions. Lately, he had been talking more often about the future. He made plans for life after his release, asked about the layout of the prison, inquired about the guard shifts. Merritt wrote it off as the natural desire of a prisoner to be closer to freedom. She herself often imagined their life together, but in her dreams it began after the legal end of her sentence. That morning, she had come in earlier than usual. She had to prepare the annual report on medication consumption. As she passed the treatment room, she heard muffled voices. The door was closed loosely, and she slowed her step involuntarily, recognizing Rafe's voice. "The nurse is ready. She's got a crush, does everything I ask. We'll use her to get the keys to the west entrance. The infirmary has a blind spot for cameras." The familiar intonation sounded unaccustomedly harsh, without the warmth she was used to. The second voice asked something unintelligible. Rafe hummed, "No." That fool really believes in the fairy tale of love. She's read too many romance novels, so... He didn't finish, but Merritt couldn't listen. She leaned against the wall, feeling the ground slipping from under her feet. Each word, spoken so casually, so sneeringly, struck a chord. Images of their meetings, his gentle touches, heartfelt conversations, passionate confessions, flashed before her eyes. Was it all a lie? Through the noise in her ears, she recognized footsteps in the hallway and forced herself to move. It was half an hour before her shift started, enough time to regain her composure and decide what to do next. Merritt mechanically prepared the office for her appointment, but her thoughts were confused and her hands trembled. Rafe appeared at the usual time, with the usual half-smile. But what she saw now was different. How carefully he surveyed the room, how he judged the distance to the door, how habitually he played the role of a lover. Merritt tried to smile back, but only a grimace came out. "What's wrong, sweetheart? You seem tense today." His voice sounded thoughtful, his eyes worried. It was the kind of look that used to make her heart sink. Now all she saw was falseness. "I heard you talking this morning, in the procedure room." The words came out on their own, even though she'd intended to remain silent. Rafe froze for a split second, so briefly she wouldn't have noticed before. But now it was different. "What are you talking about? I've been in the cell all morning." He stepped closer, reached out to cup her cheek, a familiar gesture that always made her melt. Merritt recoiled. "Don't. I heard everything. About the keys, about running away, about what a stupid..." Her voice shook, but she forced herself to speak firmly. "I'll report it to my superiors. About everything, about our meetings, about your plans." Something changed in his gaze. Gone was the feigned tenderness, something cold, dangerous. He wasn't pretending anymore. "You won't do it." His voice lowered, steel in it. "Think about it. You've broken the law, too. Your career, your freedom." "I'm willing to be punished." Merritt felt strangely calm. "But you won't be able to escape, and you won't be able to use me again." He laughed, not at all like he usually did. There was nothing human in that laugh. "Use you? Oh no, darling. You've been happy to give me everything I've asked for. You've made eyes, you've been sweet to touch, you've believed in fairy tales of love. I never imagined it would be so easy." Every word hit me hard. The scenes of their meetings came back to her mind. She saw them differently now. How he'd skillfully led her to the right decisions. How he'd steered the conversation in the right direction. How he'd gradually accustomed her to doing what he asked. "Go away." She struggled to control the tremor in her voice. "I'll call security." "And what are you going to tell them?" He moved in close. His smile reeked of coldness. "How will you explain our meetings? Do you think they'll believe you? Come on, Merritt. We both know you're not going anywhere." She took a step toward the door, but he was faster. Strong fingers clenched her wrist, where he'd left gentle kisses before. "We're not done talking yet." "Let go." Merritt tried to break free. "You're only making it worse." "Worse?" His laughter echoed in the empty office. "Oh no, sweetheart, the worse hasn't started yet, but it's about to start now, because I'm not going to let some lovesick fool ruin the plan I've been preparing for months." She saw in his eyes what she'd been hiding all this time under the mask of a lover, the cold determination of a predator. Fear came in a suffocating wave. Merritt lunged for the door but slipped on the damp floor. The last thing she saw was his face, perfectly calm without a shadow of emotion. And then darkness fell. Merritt regained consciousness from a sharp pain in the back of her head. She was lying on the cold, tiled floor of the infirmary. Through the ringing in her ears came the muffled voices of the guards in the corridor. The clock above the door read the beginning of 3. Rafe stood at the window, staring out at the blizzard. Hearing her move, he turned around. Awake. About time. He was no longer playing a role, neither a lover nor a repentant criminal. There was a completely different man in front of her. "You know, I really didn't want it to end this way," he spoke softly, as if thinking out loud. "You were the perfect cover. A couple more weeks and I would have just disappeared from your life. But you decided to ruin it." Merritt tried to get up, but the room swirled before her eyes. Blood pounded in her temples. She brought her hand to the back of her head and fumbled for the damp. It left red marks on her fingers. "Don't fidget, concussion." There was a strange concern in his voice. "I didn't mean to hit you so hard, but you left me no choice." He crouched down next to her, almost gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. The touch made Merritt shudder. "You won't get away with this." Each word came hard. "Greta knows. She has proof." Poor Greta. He shook his head. "All trying to save you. But you didn't want to be saved, did you? You liked being special, the one who could change a dangerous criminal with the power of love." There was a sneer in his tone. "I've met a lot of those. You're all the same, naive romantic fools who believe in fairy tales." Somewhere in the distance, a siren sounded, a shift change in the prison cell block. Rafe listened and turned to Merritt again. "Time's running out." "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but you know too much." She watched him pull a folding knife from his robe pocket, the same one she'd snuck him 2 weeks ago, believing a story about the need for self-defense. The blade gleamed dimly in the light of the winter day. "You know what the funny thing is?" He leaned closer, almost touching her ear with his lips. "You were naive enough to bring me everything I needed to escape on my own. Notes, medicines, tools. You didn't even think about why. You were like the heroine of a love story, a nurse in love saving a prisoner. Thank you." Merritt wanted to scream, to call for help, but only a croak escaped her throat. His hand lay on her neck, where he'd left kisses before. "Shh, there's no need to make noise. Let's finish this beautifully, like in those novels you love so much." The last thing she saw were his eyes. There was no love or regret in them now, only the cold calculation of a predator who had cornered his prey. Outside the window, the blizzard was still blowing, indifferent to human passions and tragedies. Somewhere in the corridor, there were the footsteps of guards, the jingling of keys, the noise of the heating system. An ordinary day at Oak Creek Prison was coming to an end. Mrs. Jones, the prison janitor, always started in the infirmary. Merritt would leave her with warm tea and a fresh scone. They rarely spoke, but this little tradition warmed the dank prison mornings. At 6 o'clock this morning, only silence and a strange odor greeted her. In the semi-darkness, she didn't immediately realize she was getting darker on the white tile. She wiped her eyes, turned on the light, and screamed so loudly that the entire morning security shift came running. Ezra Blackwood arrived 40 minutes after the call. He'd seen a lot of things in his 20 years on the job, but a murder in a prison, and a nurse at that, demanded special attention. He was met in the hallway by the warden, a heavy-set young man with a military bearing. "Merritt Hope, nurse. Worked for us for 3 years, perfect record. Body was discovered by the janitor an hour ago. Throat slit. This has never happened in Oak Creek before. We're a quiet prison, peaceful population." "A quiet population doesn't slit nurses' throats." Blackwood cringed at the pungent smell of bleach, which one of the overzealous guards had already begun mopping the hallway floor with. "Where's my CSI?" "Here." Sage Monroe looked out of the infirmary. In her 3 years as a couple, she'd learned to anticipate his questions. "And I've got a lot of interesting stuff for you." She carefully skirted the bloodstains on the floor, noting every detail. The overturned instrument tray, the scattered bandages, the shifting couch. On the table was an open journal, the last entry cut off halfway through. A cup of cooled tea. A woman's purse on the windowsill. "There are no cameras in the infirmary. Doctor-patient confidentiality." Sage pointed to the ceiling. "But there are tapes in the hallway. Inmate Rafe Caldwell visited her yesterday, went in at the beginning of the second, came out about a half hour later. And that's interesting." "With what?" "He shows up in the infirmary too often. I've looked at the records for the last 3 months, at least once a week. It's either a headache, a backache, a sprain, and it's always to her." A crumpled piece of paper was found in the pocket of the deceased's uniform coat, a love note written in a man's firm handwriting. Blackwood gently unfolded it. "My only one. Soon we will be together and no one can stop us." Waiting for them at the office door was the head of the infirmary, Greta Stern. The older woman, with her graying hair in a bun, looked gaunt, but she held herself upright. The hands clutching the file folder trembled slightly. "Come in." She turned on the office light. "I knew this would happen. Saw it coming. 3 months gathering evidence." Blackwood lowered himself into a stiff executive chair. Sage crouched on the windowsill, pulling out a notebook. "It all started in October." Greta opened the folder. "Merritt changed. It seems like little things, a new hairstyle, a new perfume. But I've been on the job a long time, I know how it goes. And then I noticed the discrepancies in the magazines. Caldwell started showing up too often. Merritt started staying late when she used to leave on time." "Maybe she just fell in love?" Sage asked quietly. "There's no such thing as just falling in love in prison." Greta shook her head. "Everything has a price here. Look, missing medications, strong painkillers, sleeping pills, 1 or 2 pills at a time, not to be trifled with. Weird journal entries, supposedly procedures, but the descriptions are vague, inaccurate. It's not like Merritt. She was always very careful with her paperwork." "Why wasn't it reported sooner?" Blackwood leafed through the pages written in small handwriting. "The evidence was circumstantial, and Merritt, she was so convincing. Said I was exaggerating, that I was just doing my job in good faith, that Caldwell really needed medical attention, that I was callous and seeing the worst in everything." She was quiet for a moment, smoothing a candy wrapper on the table. "You know, I've been in prison medicine for 30 years. I've seen it all. But Merritt was special, kind, bright. The inmates respected her, her colleagues loved her. And now..." Sage spread the surveillance photos on the table. "Here's Caldwell entering the infirmary, 13 hours and 20 minutes. He's limping. The log says ankle sprain, needs bandaging. He comes out at 13:50, and here we have a shift change at 2 o'clock. 10 minutes, the hallway's empty. Where's Caldwell now?" "In his cell. Claims he only came in for a dressing down. Guard confirms it's routine. Nothing suspicious." "Have her things been checked?" "Yeah." Sage pulled out a plastic bag. Cosmetic bag, purse, keys, phone in her purse, a few missed calls from a friend, and this one in my robe pocket. Another note, same handwriting. "Things are going to change today. I won't let you ruin it." Outside the window, the gray winter dawn was breaking. Somewhere in the depths of the prison, a siren wailed as a new day began. A normal day at Oak Creek, as if the young woman wasn't lying on the cold floor with her throat slit, as if the man who had turned love notes into evidence of murder wasn't waiting in her cell. Greta Stern stood up from her desk. "I have paperwork to prepare. Reports, deeds. Paperwork doesn't wait, even when..." She didn't finish, rubbing her handkerchief in her hands again. "You know, I left at 4 yesterday. The door to the infirmary was locked, but the light was on. I thought I was late with the paperwork again. Maybe if I'd checked..." "It wasn't your fault." Sage touched her shoulder gently. "No one could have predicted it." "You always have to expect the worst in prison," Greta grinned bitterly. "I'd forgotten that. And so did Merritt." When she left, Blackwood looked over the paperwork once more. "Everything here is very cleanly done. The log entries are impeccable, the ligation is confirmed, there are witnesses. The killer knew what he was doing. Knew the security system." Sage nodded. "Knew about the shift changes, the lack of cameras, the location of the guard posts. And knew where to hit." Blackwood slammed the folder shut. "Perfect cut, professional, like he's been practicing." "You think? Check his file. All the details of the robbery, all the violent incidents. Maybe we'll find something interesting." The interrogation room at Oak Creek Prison smelled of coffee. Rafe Caldwell sat relaxed back in his chair and regarded the detectives with interest. Nothing in his appearance betrayed anxiety. No stiffness in his movements, no sweat on his forehead, no trembling hands. "I'm sorry about Miss Hope." He shook his head. "She was a good nurse, attentive, caring. You know, it's rare to find that kind of treatment for prisoners here." Blackwood silently laid the surveillance photos on the table. "Tell me about your visit to the infirmary." "Sprain." Caldwell lifted his pant leg slightly, showing the bandage on his ankle. "Pulled a ligament at the gym. Miss Hope did the bandaging. You can check the log. Went in at the beginning of the second, came out about 30 minutes later. The security guard will confirm." "And explain this." Sage placed the love notes in front of him. Caldwell barely glanced at the papers. Not my handwriting. Yes, I liked her. As a person, as a professional. But a romantic relationship? In prison? I'm not that stupid. While his partner led the interrogation, Blackwood watched. Caldwell's right hand rested calmly on the table, but with his left he was subtly tapping his knee. Habit of controlling gestures or nervousness. After the interrogation, they drove to Merritt's apartment. It was a typical single woman's place, neatly cleaned, with a bunch of dried flowers on the table and a stack of love novels on the nightstand. There's a grocery list on the refrigerator and unpaid bills on the table. Look. Sage pulled a leather-covered day planner from the desk drawer. Her diary. The first entries had been dry, businesslike, work notes, to-do lists, reminders. But since October, the tone had changed. There were reflections on fate, on how everyone deserves a second chance. Rafe's name came up more and more often. He's not what everyone thinks he is, Merritt wrote. There is so much pain in his eyes, so much unspoken tenderness. I know I can help him change. Classic development. Sage slammed the journal shut. She fell in love with the image he created just for her. New discoveries awaited them in the prison infirmary. The night shift nurse, a full woman with a tired face, took a long time going through the paperwork. The weirdness started in November. The drugs went missing, a little bit at a time. You couldn't be too careful. Sleeping pills, painkillers. I thought it was a mistake in the records. Then I noticed the lock on the locker was damaged. Merritt had access to the medication? Of course she had keys, but she always kept impeccable records. And here? The nurse faltered. I'm sorry, I don't want to speak ill of the deceased. At the front desk, they found old logs. Sage immersed herself in studying the records, while Blackwood interviewed other staff members. History was repeating itself. The quiet, executive Merritt had suddenly begun to change, staying out late, appearing distracted, often smiling at her thoughts. Ezra, take a look. Sage lifted her head from the papers. Remember the Sarah Mackenzie case? The nurse from the West Prison? Found with her throat slit 5 years ago? Exactly. And do you know who was in that cell block just before she died? Blackwood took the outstretched papers. Among the transfer papers was the name of Rafe Caldwell. He had been transferred to Oak Creek a week after the murder. The Mackenzie case remained unsolved. They went back to the interrogation. This time, Blackwood came at it from a different angle. Tell me about Sarah Mackenzie. For the first time ever, something trembled on Caldwell's face. Barely noticeable for a split second, but both detectives noticed it. Don't know one, he shrugged. There's a lot of nurses in the West Prison. You were sitting in that cell block. So? I don't remember many of them. They all look the same to me. But something had changed in his posture. The relaxation was gone, his shoulders tense. He was no longer tapping his fingers on his knee. His hand was frozen, clutched in the fabric of his robe. That evening, sorting through her paperwork, Sage made a list. Increased visits to the infirmary since October, missing medications, love notes, Merritt's diary, Sarah Mackenzie's case, staff testimony, surveillance footage. Inconsistencies in the procedure log. We'll nail him. She held out the list to Blackwood. Look, it's all the same. M.O. gain his trust. Fall in love with him. Use him. But why kill? What went wrong? The answer was found in the last pages of Merritt's diary. The entry, made on the eve of her death, was hurried, the letters sprawling. I heard him talk. Everything is a lie. Every word, every look was a skillful game, and I believed it like a fool. Tomorrow I'll tell my superiors everything. I don't care what happens to me, to my career, but I won't let him use me any further. That's it. Blackwood slammed the diary shut. She's figured him out, and became dangerous. They met with Greta Stern again in the morning. The head of the medical unit had aged over the days, but her eyes looked firm. I found something else. On the day of the murder, Merritt was doing her quarterly report. Normally, she did it flawlessly. But here, look, corrections, marks. She was nervous. And this. The margins of the work log revealed hurried notes, a diagram of the prison corridors, a schedule of guard shifts, some figures. She was gathering information. Sage examined the notes, preparing evidence. And he realized it. Blackwood nodded grimly. Realized she didn't believe the pretty fairy tales anymore, that she was going to expose him, By evening, the evidence folder against Caldwell had swollen to twice its size. They methodically pieced together the details, inaccuracies in his testimony, testimony from nurses, journal entries. The story became clearer and clearer. A predator who'd found a convenient prey. A skillful manipulator who created the perfect image for a romantic girl. It remained to find the last proof, the one that would turn circumstantial evidence into irrefutable facts. And it was found in the most unexpected place. An empty coffee cup had rolled off Sage Monroe's desk for the third time. Outside the window, the winter twilight was fading and she was still reading through old police reports. The Sarah Mackenzie case kept her on her toes. Too many coincidences, too similar a handwriting. Find anything? Blackwood took off his coat, shaking off the snow. After another conversation with the warden, he looked unaccustomedly enthusiastic. Look, she spread the papers out on the table. Mackenzie worked in the infirmary too, was lonely too, and she too started changing shortly before she died. New hair, perfume, delays at work. And she fell in love with an inmate too? Exactly. Her co-workers testify in the file. She seemed to blossom, younger. She was smiling a lot, singing something. And then she was found dead, a precise stabbing with a sharp instrument to the carotid artery. Blackwood pulled the folder toward him. What about your evidence? That's the thing. Nothing concrete, just rumors, gossip, and a couple of love notes. Never found the killer. But look at this. She pulled out the visitor's log. In the week before Mackenzie's death, an inmate came to see her frequently with a hand injury. And 3 days after the murder, he was transferred to another prison. Caldwell? That's the one. And notice the MO is the same. First, he charms a lonely woman, then he uses her to get information and medicine. And when she starts to suspect something... There was a knock at the door. The courier brought the results of the examination. Here it is! Sage lifted the sheet triumphantly. They found traces of shaving cream on the sleeve of Merritt's robe, the kind only issued to prisoners, and in the pocket of Caldwell's robe were threads from a medical gown. That's something. Blackwood rubbed the bridge of his nose. But we need more for the trial. They drove to the jail again. In Greta Stern's office, they were in for a surprise. She'd found Merritt's old notebook. I was going through the files and happened to notice a corner sticking out between the pages. Greta held out the tattered notebook. It's not a diary, more like work notes. But look at the most recent entries. Merritt's handwriting became increasingly nervous, hurried. She recorded every oddity, the inconsistencies in Caldwell's stories, his persistent questioning about the security system, his attempts to elicit information about the other prisoners. Something doesn't add up, she wrote. Says he's serving time for robbery but is too good at anatomy, constantly asking about the regime in other prisons, especially about the female staff. She started to guess. Sage emphasized the last entry, realized he wasn't who he said he was. In the interrogation room, Caldwell looked as calm as ever. But something subtly changed in his gaze when Blackwood placed a photograph of Sarah Mackenzie in front of him. I don't remember one of those, he shrugged. How many there were, those nurses? Do you remember this one? Sage laid out the evidence in front of him. Shaving cream, threads from a robe, Merritt's notes. She was starting to guess, right? Realized you weren't just a burglar, that you had other murders under your belt. Speculation. He leaned back in his chair. You have no proof. But you do have a statement from your cellmate. Blackwood pulled out a new document. He heard your conversation with Merritt. He heard her threaten to tell her superiors, and saw you washing the bloody sleeve of your robe. Something trembled in Caldwell's face. For the first time in ages, he looked unsure. You know what surprises me? Sage pitched forward. How easy you find women like that. Lonely, dreaming of love, believing in fairy tales of transformation through feelings. Mackenzie was like that, and so was Merritt. They wanted to believe it themselves. Caldwell smiled suddenly. There was nothing human in his smile. So desperate to be special that they turned a blind eye to the obvious. Thought their love would change the criminal. Naive fools. So you admit it. What difference does it make? He shrugged. Mackenzie's not coming back, and neither can Merritt. You know, she believed until the last minute that I could change. Even when she realized I was using her to gather information, still hoped to get through to my conscience. Funny, isn't it? They walked out of the interrogation room in complete silence. Outside the window, snow was falling, covering the prison yard with a white blanket. Somewhere in the infirmary, a new nurse was laying out instruments for the morning intake. Life went on, but something had irrevocably changed in the familiar routine of Oak Creek. You know what the worst part is? Sage buttoned her jacket. He really doesn't think he's guilty, does he? It was just a game to him, a test to see if he can make a woman believe in a beautiful fairy tale again. Blackwood remained silent. The last entry in Merritt's notebook stood before his eyes, hurried lines of desperation and determination. I won't let him do it again. Enough with the fairy tales about love being able to change a person. Some hearts just don't know how to love. The light was on in Greta Stern's office. She was still sorting through papers, trying to find a moment when everything could have been prevented. But you can't change the past. The only thing left to do was to remember and not repeat the mistakes of others. And Rafe Caldwell sat in his cell, looking out the window at the falling snow, and smiled at his thoughts. In a neighboring wing of the prison worked a new nurse, young, lonely, dreaming of love. But that's another story.